I don't know, a couple of months ago, I've lost all sense of time. Probably 5 or 6 weeks ago at least, I was teaching a series and I talked about vulnerability. And one message that I was planning turned into a 3 weeks of messages on the subject of vulnerability. And it's such an important subject. I know I could teach it again. I haven't begun to scratch the surface on it. But in the message there, that's one of those weeks I was talking about being vulnerable with everybody who was listening and talking about how much of a struggle my last 12 years at Hidden Valley were. So where I used to pastor, in my last 12 years there, I was constantly dealing with chest pain. I'd gone to the doctor 3 times because I just thought I was having a heart attack. I had this constant extreme fatigue, ringing in my ears, dizzy spells that were so terrible that there were times I couldn't even get up because the dizziness was so bad. And I had all of these extreme physical symptoms that were just taking me out. On top of it, the only way I could function during the day was massive amounts of caffeine, sometimes 2 liters of Diet Mountain Dew a day, and the only way I could sleep at night was NyQuil every single night. I would go through a bottle a week of NyQuil, and this is how I lived for years. It was the only way to function, and so I was very vulnerable about what was going on inside of me in that message. And after the message was over, a friend of mine came up to me and said, "Man," as they listened to my story, they're like, "Wow, you must have been so anxious." And on the outside, I'm like, I nodded, I'm sure, but inward I'm like, "Anxious? Don't call that anxious." I got a little mad. I'm like, "Anxious? How could you label that as anxious?" It's like, and then I started to think about it, and I've thought about it a lot since then. I was like, I guess it kind of was anxiety. And I felt, when I started thinking about it, it's like, yeah, I had a lot to be anxious about. From my perspective, the church was really large, and I was afraid that it would grow to the point where it would be bigger than my ability to lead it. And I was so anxious about that someday they'd say, "You know what, thanks for all you've done, but you're out the door. We need somebody better than you." That's what I thought about that constantly. And on top of that, you had 14 full and part-time staff members that were completely dependent on me every single day for their income, either part or all of it. And the pressure that I felt from that was enormous. And then on top of that, you had a budget that was just gigantic. We could pay $2,000 a month in heating bills in the wintertime, just from the size of that building. And so you had all of this pressure and pressure and pressure and pressure. And I had all of this anxiety about what was going on in my life, and I never called it anxiety. You know why? Because I'm a Christian, and Christians can't have anxiety. So even just hearing it labeled as anxiety made me mad. Like, you can't say I'm anxious. I can't ever have anxiety. I'm a Christian. And the reality is, that's what it was. And the reality is, I'm not alone to have faced anxiety in my life. The reality is, every single person, I don't care how strong their faith is, at some point in life will deal with anxiety. And the results are, and when you look at what's happening in our world, if we're not honest about this, we really, really can sabotage our own personal health. Because I wouldn't label it as anxiety, I could never deal with it. So I never got better, my body just got worse. Because I wouldn't be honest about what I was actually going through. Here's honesty when it comes to anxiety in America. Psychology Today says that anxiety and anxiety disorders are the #1 mental illness in America today. #1. And you want to see something that should make you groan. I'm sorry to show you this. They recently, and so much has been done with studies about the youngest generations, Generation Z and the millennials. 44% of millennials and 48% of Generation Z admit that they feel anxious most or all of the time. Do you hear what that says? The youngest generations feel anxious most or all of the time. Almost half of them. Almost half of all people that are in that youngest generation feel anxious most or all of the time. Does that make anyone else a little bit uncomfortable to see a statistic like that? You believe this? Anxiety is a huge problem in America, and you all know COVID hasn't made it better, right? You all understand that. COVID has made anxiety go through the roof. It has escalated to a point where it is really being talked about in terms of a crisis. So we need to talk about anxiety, and we're going to spend a couple of weeks talking about this. So first off, let's define it. Anxiety is our body's natural response to perceived danger. So there's actually a really good element to anxiety, right? I mean, if you think about it, it's just your body's reaction to something that you view as dangerous. If you're in a ship in the middle of the ocean and the ship starts to sink and there's no lifeboats, no life preservers, and there are sharks circling around the outside of the boat, you feel anxious. And that's appropriate, right? It's like you are in danger. And that's real, because once that boat goes down, those sharks are going to be right there, and that's danger. So it's very appropriate. It's natural. For instance, a lot of people feel incredible anxiety if I were to say, if I were to call on you right now, hey, why don't you come on up and why don't you come up and talk, right? Anxiety, even the idea of that is like, I don't want to say anything, right? Because it feels dangerous to you. It's like anxiety, and oftentimes anxiety is a useful thing. Anxiety can help you really prepare more. You ever been anxious before a big test, and so what'd you do? You studied more. Ever been anxious before a big competition? What'd you do? You trained more. Anxiety can have a positive effect. We just never even talk about it this way. We only view it as negative. The problem is anxiety is, think of it this way. Anxiety is like a car alarm. I don't know how many of you have alarms on your car. My car is too old, doesn't have an alarm. But car alarms can be really valuable, right? My daughter Natalia lives in the Twin Cities, and recently she came out one morning and she turned her car over and it sounded like, like this. The engine was just so loud. So she looked underneath the car, and in the middle of the night, someone had pulled up next to her Prius, crawled underneath, and cut the catalytic converter out. Apparently, catalytic converters sell for a lot of money. Just cut it right out of the bottom of her car and drove off. And she had to have it replaced. Now, a car alarm would have helped her, wouldn't it? Because a car alarm could have gone, hey, get out here now, someone's damaging your car. Right? And wouldn't that have been valuable? Saved her $700. So the alarm inside of you with anxiety can be valuable. It can warn you when there's a legitimate danger. The problem is anxiety can be set in terms of sensitivity on a dial where all of a sudden your body is warning you that you're in danger when there's no real danger at all. I mean, a car alarm is valuable if it warns you that someone's trying to steal your catalytic converter. But how valuable is a car alarm if every time a leaf falls off the tree and lands on the hood, it goes off? Right? Now is it valuable? Now it's annoying, right? Now it's not good. And all your neighbors are mad and you're mad. It's like, stop going off every time a gentle breeze blows. Oh, warning, you're in danger. See, that's what anxiety can do. The dial on anxiety can get spun up so that all of a sudden anxiety is triggering, telling you you're in danger when you're not in danger. And it can get you to react when there isn't really the reason to react. That's how anxiety works. It works like an alarm. And one of the saddest things about anxiety is, I totally agree with what this one author said, anxiety makes your life smaller. It limits your life, destroys your health, and takes away the joy that God intends for you to experience. Look at those words, and I just want you to understand this. There isn't anything on that slide that God wants for you. Nothing. God wants your life full. You know that's a New Testament phrase. He's come so you can have life and have it to the fullest. He wants you to have full life. He wants you to be full of joy, and you can't be full of joy and full of anxiety. You cannot have the adventures that God wants for you and be full of anxiety. The good news is, I've read and researched on this over the last couple of weeks, and then beyond that too. And here's what I know and what they will tell you again and again: anxiety is treatable. When that dial gets spun too high, that dial can be adjusted. And we're going to start talking about this week. We're not going to finish it. We're only just going to begin. We're going to talk about what makes that dial go so high in our lives. That's all we're going to get to today. But I want you to know, for those of you who are anxiety sufferers or you know someone that really struggles with anxiety, the good news is that dial can be turned back down again. There are things that can be done to help with this. So that's what we're going to be talking about it. So we're in this series called Holding It All Together in the middle of a time when we are more anxious than ever, maybe ever in our history. Maybe you have to go back to times like the Great Depression or World War II, I don't know. Either way, in the middle of the most anxiety I've ever seen, we're going to talk about this. What do you do when you feel anxious and your anxiety is starting to grow to the point where it's really limiting your life. So when I ask you to open your program, take out the notes you'll find, grab a pen as we go through this, and all we're going to do is just point number one. We're not even going to get through all of that. I just want you to understand the first thing. This is all we're going to do. I want you to understand the basics. And while you're getting your notes out, of course, I want to welcome those of you who joined us this morning on YouTube, and those of you who've come to us through our website at penulchurchlife.com. So glad you've joined us today. I hope you find this teaching really helpful. So again, all I'm after is just this. Number one, I want you to understand what's going on when anxiety starts, when the dial gets spun too high on your anxiety. I want you to understand what's going on, because understanding is powerful. The more you understand, the more power you have. I remember recently when I was reading on this, I came across the story of a woman who has struggled with anxiety from the time she was a little girl. She was raised in a Christian home. Her dad is a very famous pastor. Her mom and dad love each other and love this girl, and so it doesn't seem like the environment where you would raise someone who is highly anxious. But that's the challenge of anxiety, is that there's sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense for the person's life. It can be very confusing. Here's what she said. She said, I can remember waking up in the middle of the night as early as 4 or 5 years old, feeling terrified and not knowing why. So it's not like she had a nightmare. She would just be full of fear at a young age. She said, the first day of school was always really hard for me every year. First day of school, every year. She said, I can remember, I have this moment frozen in my mind, standing in my locker next to my friend Shelley, when I just knew in that instant the rest of this year was going to be horrible, and every day would be full of isolation, pain, and feeling alone. Now, she said, it wasn't. It was a good year, but listen to this. Anxiety doesn't track very closely with reality. Anxiety doesn't track very closely with reality. She said, I want you to understand, anxiety is more than just nervousness. Just like depression is more than just feeling a little down. So, some of you know this firsthand, because some of you know what it's like to struggle with anxiety. You know what it's like to have anxiety limit your life. And if not you, all of us know people who really struggle with anxiety on some level. Now, obviously, there's a continuum. Just like that dial I showed you, you can be anywhere from off, where you feel no anxiety at all. Some of you feel no anxiety as you sit here today or watch me today. None. There's no anxiety in your life. It's at zero. It's off. And some of you maybe feel like there's some mild anxiety. Maybe something's going on at work or a situation that's making you feel a little anxious today. And some, that dial is spun really, really high. You would say, honestly, your dial is spun really. There's a continuum in this. And that's really important. We're going to come back to that again and again today, because you have to understand that that's what's going on. So what's causing this? What causes that anxiety to grow in our life, especially when the alarm is going off when a leaf falls on the hood? It's overreaction. It just doesn't fit the actual situation. You're not actually in danger. So here's what I want you to know. If you hear anything really, really good today, I'll try and give lots and lots of quotes to all the people that I read, but my favorite is from a Christian author named Dr. Henry Cloud. He's a Christian psychologist. I quote him all the time. I came across something in preparation for this where he did this 2-part teaching on anxiety, and so as I was typing my notes, listening to him, I'm like, I just have to teach this. There's so much good in what he has learned about anxiety, so I'll try and give credit, but if you hear anything really good, just assume it came from him. So here's what I want you to know. He talked about 4 major causes. We're only going to talk about 3 of them today. First is what he called the threat of isolation. This is a major cause. We're only talking about the major causes. There are other causes of anxiety, but these are the major ones. If your dial is spun up higher, it's more than likely going to be because of one of these 3 things or multiple. The threat of isolation. Here's how I explained it. The number one need in your life. Do you know the number one need in your life? The number one need in your life is for relationship. It is number one. There is nothing else. You are created for relationships. Relationship with God, relationship with each other. It is the number one need in your life. Whether you recognize that or not. Introverts are like, no, I don't need people. But the reality is everybody, even introverts, need some people at some level. It may not feel like it, you may not be aware of it, but the reality is you need people. We all do. So because it's our number one need, it's also it has the potential to be our number one anxiety creator, because so many of us have dealt with tremendous rejection in our life. So since it's what we need the most, when you face a lot of rejection and abandonment, it becomes the number one fear, and even the possibility of being abandoned creates a lot of anxiety inside of us. If you want to see this theologically, you go to the very first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and when it details the story of God's creative power. He's creating the universe, and he creates the sun, and he creates the moon, he creates the planet, he creates the animals, and then he creates human beings. And he creates, first off, if you've read the book of Genesis, the story of Adam, and he creates Adam, and then he says this, the Lord God said, oh, this isn't good. It is not good for man to be alone. This is not good. The only time in the story of creation where God said something wasn't good was being alone and isolated. That's not good. That's not good for any of us. In isolation, we never become the fullest person we are capable of being, ever. You will never be as healthy as you're capable of alone. It's not good. And you think about it too, theologically. Ever heard the concept of something called the Trinity? Very confusing theological idea in the Bible, that God exists in relationship. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit together as one. Separate and yet one. Now, do you know what that means? It means God lives every moment of existence in relationship. Every moment. And you are created in the image of God. Since you're created in the image of a completely relational being, we need relationships to be healthy. But again, since it's our number one need, it's also the number one potential for triggering anxiety. Because the reality is, isn't it true that people can accept you or reject you, right? People can make you feel wanted, but have you ever had anyone make you feel unwanted? Maybe someone that was supposed to make you feel wanted made you feel unwanted. And now all of a sudden your number one need becomes your number one anxiety producer. See, people who have that dial spun up really high on the anxiety level, they don't assume at the end of the day that they won't be alone. They really fear that they will be. And that's what generates so much anxiety in their lives. Dr. Cloud in his teaching said this. He said, take a kid and think about this situation. All of you have probably seen this, or if you think about it, it makes sense, right? You take a kid who comes from a healthy, stable family in America. Husband and wife who love each other and love that child. And that child knows that they are completely loved by mom and dad. So they live their life in that environment. So they go to school. What happens at school? Well, you meet jerks, right, at school? Any jerks at school, any bullies at school, any mean kids. And what happens? They meet this idiot, and they're like, well, that person's an idiot, and they walk away. It doesn't change their whole life because they are rooted in the connections that they have in their environment at home, where they feel deeply loved and deeply treasured. And so the rejection of this bully or these kids, these idiots at school, doesn't really affect them all that much. It doesn't spin the dial up because they're secure in these relationships. That makes sense? But what happens in an environment where a child is raised where there is not that stability? What happens to kids who are raised in homes where there's lots of rejection and conditional love and abandonment by people who should have loved them, or insecure attachments? What do you think happens to them? Where do you think that dial gets set? You think that's going to affect their anxiety about the number one need in their life, to be loved and connected deeply with other people? Yeah, you bet it does. It spins that anxiety level up even higher, so that in the future, even things that have the potential to create rejection, even if they don't, will create a lot of anxiety. The dial goes up. For instance, people who struggle with anxiety, even the idea of asking someone out on a date just spins that anxiety level all the way up. Or applying for a new job that they may be fantastic at spins that up because the person could say no, right? Even the idea of it, not the experience of it, can trigger the anxiety. The interesting thing is, when I was learning about this, and I was thinking about this one, I have a vivid memory of a time when I saw this, and I saw the positive of it, and I didn't even know what was happening. Matter of fact, I've wondered about it ever since it took place. I was a young pastor, early 1990s. I was living in Madison at the time, when there was this family started coming to the church. Just a mom and her 2 kids, no dad in the life at all. The mom worked several jobs just to try and make ends meet. What I did not know is, she was living with a guy who was a monster to the children. So many times in those kind of situations, they let a predator in, right? Because you ever wondered about this? Why are they with that person? You know why they're with that person? Because being with a bad person is better than being alone. For many, many people, they will choose that because the number one need in their life is relationship and connection, and they will take fake love over nothing. That's why they do it again and again and again. And so she'd let a predator in the house who was just torturing the kids, and I didn't know this, the kids were young, but one of the things you saw in the behavior of the boy, and he was very young, probably 6, 7, 8, or 9, somewhere in there, he was acting out a lot, as you can imagine. I mean, anything triggered this tremendous violent temper and anger, and he was always kind of hyper, and it's like a kid that you fed sugar all the time. It's like, and what now in the context of all of this, his dial of anxiety was spun to 10, because every situation, every time he came home, he was in danger. He was in danger every time he walked into the home. So you know what happens when you live in that environment? Your dial gets set like this. It's like soldiers that go to war, right? We know this. We send them overseas to fight our battles, and they are in danger every day, right? And so their anxiety level is spun to high because they have to be on alert, and then they bring them back here, and then all of a sudden they're not in danger anymore. Does the dial just spin right back? Doesn't spin back for kids either. Raised in these environments, didn't spin back for that kid. And one day, I don't remember the situation that triggered it, but this kid just blew. Was so angry, was threatening to stomp out, throw things, just so angry and out of control. And in that moment, we sat him down and said to him, listen, and I don't know, this had to be from God because it wasn't strategic. We didn't know any of this. But it was, just so you know, no matter what you do, we're going to always love you. We are going to always love you. And you'll never make us not love you. And it was, now in these words, like the dial was spun down to 0. The behavioral change that took place in that kid in that moment was dramatic. And I wondered about it for 20 years until prepping this message. It's like, oh, without even knowing it, what we had done is taken the greatest anxiety source in the life of this boy. That you won't want me either. That you won't want me around. And we'd addressed it. And in doing that, the anxiety, literally for this kid, it was like a switch. And it was gone. And I never understood what happened until prepping for this. So again, how secure are the connections that you were in the home where you were raised? How securely loved did you feel? How secure are your connections now? If you have a lot of strong and secure connections where you just know you're loved and nothing will change that, then chances are your anxiety is probably a little bit lower. But if you have a lot of insecurity in those, then anxiety goes up. They're connected because it's your number one need. Now, this is your number one need, but in Dr. Cloud's experience, it's not the biggest driver of anxiety in America today. In his experience, in his counseling practice, this is the threat of not being able to control what affects us. Now, this is anecdotal. It's just based on his experience, right? So it may be, these aren't in any order in terms of what are the most important ones. But in his experience, in his counseling practice, this is the biggest one. The threat of not being able to control what affects us. And it'll make sense once we go through it a little bit. Some of you already make sense right now. Here is the reality of the world that we live in. Daniel wrote this verse thousands of years ago. He said, God, He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise. God alone is God, and totally in control, even when it seems like everything around us is out of control. It's never true. He alone is in control. But are you and I in control? Are we in control? No. There are plenty of things in our life that happen that are beyond our ability to control. We do not have control. And in this, again, if you are raised in a home where things are out of control, where there's chaos or abuse or alcoholism or other addictions, or if you're raised in a home where you have a parent that has a volatile temper and you never know what's about to trigger that thing, that dial just gets spun to 10. That dial gets spun so high because you are in danger, and your anxiety is warning you appropriately, right? Every time you walk in the room, you have to be on alert because you don't know how drunk dad is. You don't know how angry mom is. You don't know. So you have to be on alert. So your anxiety is really important in that context to save you. But then what we do is, of course, we get out of that environment, we just bring that dial with us. It's spun. And we've been programmed to view things as dangerous and people as dangerous. Even in many cases when they're not, we're on alert. Your anxiety is telling you bad things are about to happen. And so for many people who've been raised in those environments or lived in those environments, what they develop is this fear of being out of control. As the anxiety goes up, oftentimes what goes up with it is a desire to control your world around you. Because the idea that I could let someone in who could hurt me is terrifying. So I'm going to control them, and I'm going to control my world, and I'm going to control everything about this, so that I don't have to be anxious and I don't have to get hurt anymore. Flip your notes over and look at the back of this. One of my favorite authors that I read regularly is this Dr. Sharon Martin. She's, to my knowledge, not a Christian, but I'll learn from anybody. And her blog is fantastic, and I get her blog feed all the time and read it. She is very insightful. She had these things about signs that you're too controlling, or that this is an issue in your life, and I just put it on here as a resource for you, but I also wanted to highlight her stuff because it's good. But here's my question for those of you who have ever, if some of you know that you're a smidge controlling, right? Some of you know that. If you don't know that, some of you around you know that you are a smidge too controlling. Others of you know people who are too controlling. It was your mom, so controlling about everything in your life, or your dad, so controlling, right? Or a grandparent, you couldn't please them, okay? So we all know people who are too controlling, or we have this inside of us, and it's rooted in anxiety. And one of the authors said this, one of the psychologists said, when things feel out of control, it's natural to want to control them in order to feel safe. That makes sense, right? Things are out of control, so I'm going to get control and make things safe by controlling everything. But of course, we can't control other people and situations, so our efforts don't ultimately make us feel better. In fact, controlling behaviors usually create problems in our relationships that make us feel frustrated and stressed out. Isn't that an amen statement? Do you know that? Do you know that when you try and control people and situations, that the outcome is going to be frustration and pain for you and that person? Do you get that? Some of you know that. Some of you know it, and it's still hard to stop it. It's a very common reaction to anxiety. So do you see this as an issue in the anxiety that you've struggled with? I've been hurt, so I'm not going to let other people or situations hurt me. I feel anxious, so I'm going to control everything around me. Makes sense, right? Makes sense. Common cause, and in his experience, the number one cause. Now, we're only going to talk about one more. The third biggest cause is the interpretation of failure or loss. Or, keeping in the threat world, and I didn't put this on your notes, you might want to write it on the side, and it's the threat of imperfection. So the others are threats. The threat of isolation, not being loved, the threat of not being in control of what's affecting me, and the threat that I'm imperfect. So, how do you interpret failure or loss? Here, I really want you to answer this question in your own mind. What goes through your head when you fail? How do you talk to yourself when you fail? Or when someone around you fails? And the two things I want you to think about are, what do you say, and what's the tone of what you say to yourself when you fail? What do you say, and what's the tone of what you say to yourself? And if you really want a third question, really go deeper. I had a counselor ask me this once. Whose voice are you actually hearing? Whose voice is that? Because sometimes it's the voice of your dad, or it's the voice of your mom, or it's the voice of an ex. It's the voice of someone else that's significant in your life. What do you say to yourself when you fail? What's the tone of what you say? You know, I've had people in my life who could not handle any element of failure in their life in any way. None. Any amount of failure in their life triggered an explosive reaction. And what I realize now, after their dial was spun to 10. And it makes sense because I knew the background of this person. I knew the home they were raised in. The home they were raised in, to just be acceptable in the family, you had to be perfect. Not to be loved, just to be accepted. You had to be perfect. So what do you think it's like to be raised in a home where just to be on the okay level, you have to be perfect? And this person's personality was wired to try and please mom and dad. So they learned that perfection made you acceptable. So what happens if you're not perfect? Do you think you got mom and dad's love then? Nope. You got speeches and nagging and lectures and manipulation. So the consequence of being raised in an environment like that is that anxiety is always up. And the biggest thing that spins that dial to 10 for that person, failing in any way, any failure at all, instant anxiety on the highest level. So the question is, how do you interpret? Now, the interesting thing about it, I mean, it's kind of a doubt, right? If you're just beginning your spiritual story with us, you're just beginning your spiritual journey with us, maybe you're watching online, somebody recommended this, and you're just learning this, and you're like, okay, this makes sense to me. Christianity will never make sense without understanding and accepting this foundational truth, and that is that we are all complete failures spiritually. Sorry. There is no Christianity without that. Christianity doesn't make sense. You'll just view Jesus as kind of an optional thing, throw in your life, maybe not throw in your life, who cares? Maybe I'll have him, maybe I won't, maybe I'll have money and possessions and career and all that stuff. That's the most important thing. But it will never, ever, ever be the transformational thing in your life until you understand the spiritual reality that Jesus came to reveal to us, that we are spiritually at a point of complete failure in the eyes of God. And here's how it's worded in the Bible. Romans 3:23, everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. We aren't even close. We're not even remotely close to a being of pure love. God is love, the Bible teaches. Pure love. Never been unloving, never had an unloving thought, never had an unloving deed, never ever in his existence has he been anything other than love. Now, how far short of loving, perfect love do you think you fall? How far short of perfectly loving do you think you fall? Do you think you're perfectly loving? Think you've been perfectly loving all your life? I mean, we are so far short of that, right? I have been unloving with my words and thoughts and deeds all my life. I have fallen short, is what the Bible says, of his perfect standard. That's why Jesus is important. Matter of fact, that's why Jesus is essential. Because to be with God, I have to be like him, and I'm not. And so Jesus won't even make sense until you understand this spiritual truth, that we are failures, but this is so hard for people to admit. Especially people who have been raised in that home like the person I was describing. They really struggle with this. Here's how one person described it. So what they often do is they become perfectionists. And perfectionists can come out in different ways. I didn't know this until this message. I did not know this. There are different forms of perfectionism. This one person said, perfectionists crave predictability. Do you know anyone who just likes routines, and they have routines, and they don't vary from their routines, and varying from their routines causes them anxiety? They are risk averse. They want to know they can succeed at something before they even try it. They're rigid and anxious and demanding and critical of themselves and sometimes other people too. Some perfectionists mainly try to hold themselves to impossibly high standards. So these are the kids, you ever know a kid that blew up or melted down if they didn't get an A+ on an exam? Did you ever raise a kid like that? It's like perfect was the only acceptable standard. And that's a form. Then they said in some cases, their perfectionism comes out in eating disorders. You ever know anyone with an eating disorder? The only acceptable place for me is perfect in body image. Is that achievable in America? Not a chance. Not even close. or body images. Other people's perfectionism, this is what I didn't know, comes out in the way they hold other people to impossibly high standards. And that's how their perfectionism comes out. The only way you get to be in my life is if you're perfect. So we know, here's the thing, you know what ideal looks like, and shooting for the ideal is a good thing, right? I should shoot to get better as a teacher. That's a good thing, right? I'm a college student right now. I should shoot to get better in my grades. But what if I don't get an A+? What goes on inside of you? What do you say to yourself, and what's the tone of what you say when you're not perfect? So here's my questions for you. If it's not perfect, is it all bad? Is it all bad? If I'm not perfect, am I all bad? For many, many Christians, that sentence right there is what destroys churches. You want to know why pastors live with the illusion of perfection? Do you know what happens in churches if pastors are human beings and just flawed like every other human being? Not good experiences for pastors. Do you know what happens to church kids? You see how many church kids go off the rails? Do you know why? Because in the church world, you can only be perfect if you're a pastor's kid. So toxic, these environments that we create. So if I'm not perfect, am I all bad? How about this? If I have a problem with you, are you all bad? That happens. When the anxiety goes up, these are the things that go through our minds. What do you say to yourself when you're not perfect or someone around you isn't perfect, and what's the tone of what you say? People with anxiety are so afraid of imperfection because, again, they could get hurt, that the alarm goes off inside of them. The car alarm, you're in trouble, you are in danger. They're not perfect. You are in danger, and you need to make this right. So you need to nag and criticize and control them until they're back in the place where they need to be so that you're not in danger anymore. And of course, it's so destructive. Again, what's your capacity for dealing with the desire for the ideal and the reality of not ideal? How do you handle the gap between perfect and imperfect, which is all we actually have? Now, one of the cautions that if you've ever been around somebody who's really struggled with anxiety, their dial is dialed higher, here is the caution. Watch out for catastrophizing the negative. So it's a big, funny word. I want to just have you just write it down, catastrophe. You know what a catastrophe is. I mean, it's like the worst thing that could happen. A hurricane comes through and destroys an entire community. That's a catastrophe. That's a catastrophe. A tornado comes through and wipes out Barneveld. That is a catastrophe. Getting a 98 on an exam, is that a catastrophe? But do you know what happens when anxiety is spun up? You catastrophize everything. Everything becomes a catastrophe. So catastrophizing the negative means that you jump to the worst possible conclusion from every situation that you're facing. And when you see somebody whose anxiety level is really high, this is what they do. Every single thing that is mildly upsetting to them is a crisis that they have to endure. When the anxiety goes up, this is what happens inside of them. It's like everything is a catastrophe. So this is the person, if they make a mistake at work, they're the ones who say to you, I know I'm about to be fired. I am the worst employee there. Nobody likes me. My manager can't stand me. Now, the reality is for people like this who are high anxiety, they're usually their manager's favorite because they do things almost perfectly, but they don't think that way about themselves. In their mind, they're constantly beating themselves up because they notice every little mistake, and every little mistake is an opportunity for them to berate themselves in a harsh way. So they're catastrophizing every negative thing. This is the person who makes a mistake in a relationship and they think you want to be done with them. I don't know why you're with me. I don't know why you stay with me. It's just a catastrophe. We catastrophize negative, and here is where I had one of the most interesting biblical thoughts that I've ever had when I was prepping this message. Have you ever read the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus? Ever read this story? It is an incredible story, and it's very confusing if you don't understand anxiety. If you don't understand anxiety, you won't understand what happens in the story of the book of Exodus. You want to see what happens when somebody's dial is spun high? Read the book of Exodus. Here's what happens. The nation of Israel lives in slavery in Egypt. So if you know the story of Moses and 10 Commandments, ever see the 10 Commandments? You usually show it at Easter time, so you know. So God sends Moses, set my people free. Now, these are people who've been in slavery for generations. Do you think slaves have a higher anxiety than non-slaves? Do you think about what it's like to be a slave, especially like a slave in Egypt a couple thousand years ago? Do you think they were ever in danger? Oh, they lived, every moment they woke up, every day they woke up, they were in danger from the moment they woke up. Because they were slaves, that meant they were property. That meant at any time an Egyptian could beat them, or whip them, or kill them, or rape them, or take all of their property from them. And what rights would they have to defend themselves? Zero. So what do you think, where do you think their dial gets set if you're living in an abusive situation like that for generations? How high do you think that was? Super high, right? I mean, it makes sense. That's what's going to happen if you're living in a slave environment, is that dial spun to 10 and it stays there. So God sends Moses back and says, set him free. Moses, it's interesting who God chose. He chose someone who wasn't a part of that anxiety system to send him back. But Moses still had anxiety. So God sends Moses back, and God starts to delivers them from slavery in Egypt, and he brings them over to the promised land. Now, the interesting thing about what God does is he goes really slow. He could have made it right away. They could have gone right there, but he wanted them to deal with their own anxieties first. It's so interesting when you understand what was happening. God wanted to rewire their brains. That's the beauty of anxiety. Your brain got wired. A soldier, it makes sense, right? You put a soldier in a war environment, a war theater. Before they go to war, they don't have their dials spun to 10, do they? They don't view everything as a threat. A loud noise doesn't happen, and they don't jump. But then they go to war and it's spun to 10 because a loud noise in a war environment means bad things, right? And then they come back here and it's still spun, so a loud noise still triggers that anxiety response. Think about it. The brain got rewired. That's the beauty of what we know about our brains today. Science has proven that your brains are rewirable. That's what I love about anxiety. Your brain got wired that way. Your brain can be wired back. Did you know that? There is great hope for people who struggle with anxiety, and God was in the rewiring business in that journey. It's why he took so long. He wanted them to learn to depend on him in the middle of everything that came along. Now, if you know the story of Exodus, did they do that? Did they trust in God? Did they spin that anxiety dial down? No, they totally blew it. Matter of fact, any single thing that went wrong was a catastrophe. And that's exactly what you read in the story. One time they were going along and they didn't have water, and it's a catastrophe. The next day, they didn't have food. Now, God was literally feeding them, but he wasn't feeding them what they wanted. Look at how they responded. Exodus 16:3, it says, "If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt," they moaned. "There we sat around pots filled with meat, and we ate all the bread we wanted, but now you've brought us into the wilderness to starve us all to death." Now, is that what God had done? Had God brought them to the wilderness to starve them all to death? Did they really have it so good when they were slaves in Egypt that they just sat around full pots every day? Of course not. But that's what happens when anxiety is spun up. You are reading in the book of Exodus what happens if you let anxiety take your life. If you let anxiety go to those higher levels and you don't learn how to manage your anxiety and spin that dial back down, then it will limit you. It will steal your joy. It will make you unhealthy. All those things we talked about at the beginning. It will destroy your life. It is never what God wants for you. And God repeatedly tried to take the dial down. The story of God's patience in that book is just amazing, as he tried to readjust that dial for him. Because anxiety makes you miserable. It takes so much away from you, and God doesn't want that taken from you. Now, so again, the question is this: how much ability do you have internally to tolerate things not being okay, and that's okay? How much ability do you have internally to tolerate things not being okay, and that's okay? There's one more thing I have to say before I wrap this up. If you want to read something interesting, go to Psychology Today, again, not a Christian website, Psychology Today, and Google, and search in there, anxiety plus social media. Anxiety plus social media. We have to address this. You will find, study after study, I got a study right here, a direct link between the levels of anxiety and depression and the amount of social media you consume. How much time you spend on Twitter and Facebook and all these other things. It is directly related. We know this. If you spend time or you let your kids spend time on there, do you know what's going to happen to them? Their anxiety and level of depressions will go up. Their dials will get spun the wrong way. Think about this. And you want to know why? Because social media allows for the illusion of perfection. Social media allows for the illusion of perfection. I have seen this firsthand again and again. I know this couple. And if you knew this couple and were friends with them on Facebook, you would think they have the perfect life. Because you can put a pretty filter on when you put your face up there, and it prettifies you. And so you look at them, they're just like, oh, she's so beautiful. He's so handsome, because you got a pretty filter, and it just kind of takes away all the stuff. And then on top of that, every picture is them at a restaurant, doing something fun, hiking in the woods, taking pictures. It's just this beautiful life, and she's draped all over, loves him so much, and everything's just beautiful, and they only eat great food, and they drink great drinks, and everything's perfect, perfect, perfect. I know this couple firsthand. Their relationship is an absolute disaster. They can't stand each other. And nobody who knows them outside of the few people knows the truth. But this is the problem with all of these social media things we have in our society. It allows for the illusion of perfection. So our kids are growing up watching all of this unfold on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and they're getting the illusion of perfection. They're like, dang, she's beautiful. She has no flaws. Look at their marriage. It's perfect. Anybody who knows this couple, that's perfect. They have the perfect marriage, and they have perfect experiences and perfect food and perfect drinks and perfect vacations. Everything's perfect. And then they look at their own life, and what do they feel? Feel perfect? And all the studies say the more social media you consume, the more anxiety and the more depression you have. Because it feeds the illusion of perfection, and the illusion of perfection spins the dial of anxiety. And parents, I didn't know this. When I was raising my kids, I did not know this. And I contributed to the anxiety that my kids deal with because I never talk to them about the dangers of social media, even though we know it and can validate it. These kids today, you want to know why 48% of the youngest generation feel anxious most or all the time? Because nobody's telling them this, even though we know it. This is a big issue. Big issue. I've only begun to address it today. Here's what I'm talking about. This is serious, and my goal is just to help you understand people today. That's all I wanted. If you're struggling with anxiety, there are underlying issues. There are underlying causes. There's a reason that you're feeling anxious. Now, the good news is it's treatable. It's completely treatable. That dial that's spun up can be spun down. It got spun up because of something, and it can be spun back down because of learning how to address these underlying causes. It's really good news. But here's why I'm really saying this to you. For those of you who love someone who struggles with anxiety, you have to hear me say this. When I was researching and doing prep for this, I went onto the websites of some of the biggest names of Christian speakers, and I read what they have to say about anxiety, and it was actually very frustrating, because people whose dial never goes above 2 or 3 talk about anxiety in stupid ways. And I'm sorry to use that word, but that is how they talk about it. Their answers are pithy little answers. Well, all I have to do is just read my Bible and pray, and then the anxiety goes away. Great. And if your anxiety knob never goes above 2 or 3, I'm sure that works perfectly for you. But do you have any idea what that sounds like to someone whose anxiety knob is spun to a 10, and you just tell them to read their Bible or pray a little bit? It is so insulting and so degrading, and this is the world that we have. And so it adds guilt and shame on top of a problem that's already debilitating to these people. You have one responsibility when you are dealing with someone who's struggling with anxiety, and it is to listen, understand, and validate their feelings for them. That's it. They don't need anything else from you. And every type of pithy little answer you want to get will only hurt them and make the problem worse. It's not your job to solve their anxiety. It's your job to love, understand, and validate and say, you know what, I bet that is challenging for you. I'm so sorry that that's your reality right now. I'm so sorry you're going through this. You validate it. You don't try and solve it. If you try and solve it, you're part of the problem. Well-meaning Christians have contributed to the problem of anxiety getting worse because we just have these pithy little answers. And so many of them, it's because their dial never went above 3 or 4. So you don't even know what you're talking about. And you're well-meaning, you want them to feel better, and by doing it, you're being destructive. So part of why I did this message today is that you would understand this is a bigger issue. This is a big deal, and when somebody risks talking about their anxiety, they've given you a precious gift. And how you handle it when they tell you that they're feeling that way is imperative. That you just listen to them, and you understand them, and you validate it. Because the reality is, you want to know the reality? If you had lived the life they've lived, you would feel the way they feel. If you'd been that boy raised in that home where every day he came home, he never knew if he was going to be touched, beaten, kicked, burned, guess how you'd feel today? Guess where your dial would be? And you think you would want someone to say, well, just pray about it. You think that's what you'd want to hear? This is imperative that you understand so you can give people what they actually need and not contribute and make the problem worse. We have not done cure today. All we've done is address some of the underlying causes. We will get into some solutions next week. But I thought it was so important that you understand that the whole focus today has just been this. That's all we're doing. And when it comes to understanding, boy, I hope you understand now why Jesus is absolutely essential to your life. If you don't, you still don't understand the message of Christianity. Jesus isn't just an optional thing. Think about Jesus or don't think about Jesus. It doesn't really matter. The reality is you are a mortal human being and your time on earth is coming to an end. And then you will stand in front of a being of pure love. And he will evaluate you based on the standard of perfect love. You want to be evaluated on that standard? Now that sounds like bad news. But what it does is it reveals the incredible good news of what God did for us by sending his son Jesus into the world. When Jesus was hung on that cross, he took into his body every unloving thing I've ever said or done. Every unloving thing you have ever said or done. Paid for it all in full. And if you will let him, he will forgive you. He will make you clean. Your soul will be made perfect forever. That's what the Bible's promise is. Let me have you bow your heads. Maybe this is the next step for you spiritually, is to let Jesus Christ give you this incredible, incredible gift. He wants so badly to pay for what you've done. He already paid in full on a cross. No more payment needs. And if you will let him, he will forgive you and he will make his home inside of you. He will never leave you. No matter what anyone says or does, he will always be with you. And if you want this, say something like this in your heart to him. Say, Jesus, I turn to you today. I need you. I've been unloving. I know it. I can't deny that. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. I've heard today that you gave your life for me. And I need you. Come and make your home inside of me today. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, as we finish today, I want to ask you all to, if you're here, just grab your connection card. If you're watching online, go to our website, PennyhillChurchLife.com. There's a little Contact Us tab. And just let us know if you prayed that prayer, if you want us to pray for you. Again, if you're online, you can just fill it out on that Contact Us tab. If you're here, you can fill the card out. Just take a moment and fill this out, and then drop it in one of the 2 offering boxes back on the back wall where you came in. Thanks so much for coming. We hope to see you again next week as we continue this very important topic.